You may have heard English is 3 languages in a trench coat. This is referencing the fact that most of English vocabulary is sourced from 2 separate languages, and the fact that 3 is just like a round number. Now, this is more than a little misleading. It's not like Norman vocabulary has supplanted the core of English vocabulary. Pronouns, prepositions, modal verbs, and plenty of common nouns are from Old English. In fact, looking at average speech, words of Old English origin pull far ahead of Norman words. And when I tested this, even removing repeats and some function words, it still forms a clear majority. Overall, English really is one language, especially compared to like Italian or Arabic. It is definitely wearing a trench coat, though. So last time I looked at 3 corpuses, and the conclusion I came up with is Anglo-Saxon vocabulary flies under the radar and carries general meaning. Anglo-Norman vocabulary is more specific and technical. But I said triple it. I took 9 different passages and looked at the first 150 unique words in each of them, and now, based on the origin and the data, we're going to make some conclusions. We'll look at them in the order of the most Anglo-Saxon to the most Anglo-Norman. So what do you think would be the most Anglo-Saxon? By my definition, general, something anyone can pick up and read no matter what they have experience with. And the number 1 most Anglo-Saxon passage was, in fact, a YA novel, The Unwanteds by Lisa McMahon. Composed of a whopping 73.3% Old English origin, it even beats out the previous record holder Technoblade. It only has 20.7% Norman, giving it a ratio of 3.55. Honestly, nothing is too surprising about this. It has no need for technical language, it's written in simple text enough for a child to understand. It's marketed for all audiences, and the language it uses reflects that. Perhaps it's appealing to some sense of the Anglo-Saxon common man when English speakers was a nation state, but hopefully not. One thing I'm not going to do in this video is draw any sociolinguistics conclusions. The author used the word hard instead of firm. I'm not going to ask why they did that. I'm not going to ask why one is perceived one way or another. It's a simple text for children. It uses Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, so it makes sense to conclude that Anglo-Saxon vocabulary is simple. I suppose it doesn't make sense to conclude anything with such a limited data set, so we move on to the next passage. With 72% Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, we have 6 foot, 7 foot by the goat Wheezy. This actually came as a surprise to me. I had assumed that if you were forced to rhyme, then you would be forced to use more obscure vocabulary, therefore leaning on the larger well of Anglo-Norman words. But I guess when you're as good of a lyricist as Lil Wayne, it just comes naturally. Also, me not knowing anything about lyricism, it seems equally likely that it forces you to rely on a small set of easily rhymable single-syllable words, which would instead tip the scales to Anglo-Saxon. It also has a much higher ratio of Saxon-Norman vocabulary because of the sheer volume of other. Charisma is from Greek, vodka is from Russian, spritzer is from German, sequin is from French, tuna is from Spanish, mink is from Swedish, ass is from a Celtic language, and the N-word is maybe Portuguese or Spanish. It's ultimately from Latin, but it really could have gotten here from anywhere. And again, the common thread is commonness. Given the vulgarity, it's obviously not for kids, but rap music was the voice of a marginalized lower class, and music in general is meant to speak to the universal human experience. I shouldn't have to justify this. Vulgar is derived from a word that means common. These two topics are very similar. So, next up at 68% Anglo-Saxon is the spoken dialogue of The Princess Bride by William Goldman, starting from the Shrieking Eels scene. Now, we can immediately see the presence of a lot more vocabulary that kept the other two so high. This character, Vicini, likes to feel self-important and so uses a bunch of unnecessarily Norman words. However, he's also kind of the only one who does that. Beyond that, it's also clear that as much as there's a base of Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, there's also a base of Anglo-Norman vocabulary. Just around very to weight, person and animal are the big 6. It's clearly not as big or universal as the Anglo-Saxon core, but it's still very common. Speaking of which, with this larger codex, I have the opportunity to finally categorize this core I keep speaking of. The Anglo-Saxon words that occurred in 2/3 or more of all the datasets were go, do, have, with, all, thing, get, some, not, down, on. Thing is most frequently found in compounds. And going back to The Princess Bride again, it's a family movie. It's got a PG rating. Kids watch it. Kids hear the dialogue and are expected to understand it. So it uses Saxon vocabulary. Simple as. So how about something else aimed at kids? The fourth largest Saxon percentage, 65.3%, comes from Breaking Minecraft Monday records with Filza by Technoblade. Now, as much as Minecraft is kids content, that wasn't what made the other two more Saxon. What made them more Saxon was the fact that they were family content. The words used to describe specific adult things are Norman, and so are the words used to describe specific kid things. It's the specificity that kills you. Even so, in the beginning of the stream, Technoblade isn't really talking about Minecraft, he's just interacting with chat. But whenever he's troubleshooting his stream or bringing up game mechanics or discussing the upcoming competition, he slips into Anglo-Norman vocabulary. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here, I've already covered Technoblade previously. There's not too much biasing him in either direction, there's a reason he's about in the middle. Exactly in the middle, though, is Immense World by Ed Young. This is an educational book about different animals' senses. It may surprise you to see an educational book this high, given how Anglo-Norman the last one was, but this one starts with an introduction, which is basically a bunch of animals in the room, and the narrator describes what it's like from all of their perspectives. So we are getting something similar to a fiction book. Obviously, though, this one is aimed at adults, which clearly has made all the difference. Also, there still is some technical language, but mostly the narrative aspect keeps it balanced. Next, we move into the more Norman half. Now, even though this is the more Norman half, the first two will still have a majority of Saxon vocabulary, and even the last two have more Old English than Norman, which on some level is the point I'm trying to make, but it also does have to do with complexity, so the next highest is Better Call Saul Season 3, Episode 5 by Vince Gilligan. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't include the chicanery rant because it's at the end of the episode. At the beginning, we have Jimmy talking to the veterinarian, and then Kim dealing with a bank for Mesa Verde. Obviously, a conversation between a lawyer and her clients is more specific, and we see the second half of the episode has way more Norman vocabulary. However, we would expect that anyways, because in the beginning, we get through the Saxon core vocabulary I've been talking about this whole time, and then we don't get to repeat them. So, yeah, we see the same trend in every other passage too. But it's also because the veterinarian spends some time lecturing Jimmy on how to properly care for a fish, so both halves are pretty specific. But at the same time, it is mostly dialogue. That means no matter how formal it is, most of the specifics come from context and body language, and you don't need a ton of Norman vocabulary to explain everything. And when we change that, the Anglo-Saxon percentage goes down. Next up, with 61.3% Norman vocabulary, is Leviticus 21 by Moses, New International Version. In these chapters, Moses is laying out the law for how priests should act as revealed from God. Now, the most central of central church vocabulary is Saxon, but almost all the rituals, sacrifices, and cleanliness described use Norman vocabulary. But a lot of the chapter is also describing how priests should conduct themselves in their personal lives, which in turn uses almost all Saxon vocabulary. And then I ran out of chapter 21 to use, so I moved on to 22, which is more about average people. I included the Bible to answer the obvious question of formality, and to be honest, it didn't really come through. Yes, the formal ones are all on this side, but that's more a side effect of the specificity. You're only going to be using formal language if you have something specific to talk about, and it's very possible to be technical without being formal. Just ask my YouTube channel. No, seriously, next up is the Worm Tier List Part 1 by Zzineohp. I chose this video of mine because it felt like I was being the least technical, that's how I remember it at least, but apparently I was wrong, and only 48% Saxon vocabulary. After a brief introduction containing most of the Saxon words, I launch into a vocab-heavy description of the various internal workings of the earthworm and tapeworm, both of which are very complicated and require me to explain background knowledge. It's just very dense. It's not meant for all casual audiences, and therefore, it's not very Anglo-Saxon. The illustrations add a little context, but it's not nearly enough. And when we take those away, we're left with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything by Tasha the Witch Queen, published by Wizards of the Coast. This book begins with a large preface written in character by Tasha, and she periodically interjects with various snide remarks, and not to sound hyperbolic, but this is the most pretentious lady I've ever read. I suppose that's charming for some. In addition, she is being educational. The book is lore, and she's describing fantasy elements, which are by nature specific. But again, I cannot overstate the pretentiousness aspect. Check this out. Sanctimonious, luminaries, esteem, multiverse, marginalia. And despite all that, the proportion of Anglo-Saxon vocabulary is still higher than the Anglo-Norman. No, that's only if you don't count Latin, which you probably should. They seem to correlate similarly. And that's my conclusion. I think it's pretty clear that the more specific technical and narrowly focused your text is, the more Norman vocabulary you'll use. Something for entertainment for all audiences is likely to have more Saxon vocabulary. And since I've been researching nothing but etymology all day, let's look at some cool things I noticed. Defile, despite starting with a Latin-esque root and therefore looking very, very Norman, is actually from befoul, an Old English word, which is just heavily influenced by Norman. The prefix arch in archangel, in other words, is actually from Old English and was originally pronounced with a ch sound. Rube, meaning a stupid person, is the same story as Chad and Karen, and was originally the name Reuben, and vanilla is a doublet of vagina.